Why was the valley so quiet? Even after 5 deployments, Ellie Young had learned to listen for the silence. It wasn't peace, not here, not in this part of Helmand province. Silence meant the enemy was waiting, listening, watching. The air was dry enough to sting her throat as she crouched behind a crumbling mud wall, her pulse loud inside her helmet. The sun had just begun to push the shadows off the valley floor, turning the dust into a thin haze of gold. To anyone watching from a drone camera above, Charlie Company would have looked like a handful of ants moving through a broken maze of compounds and ditches. But down here, every heartbeat felt like it might be the last. 6 hours ago, it had all seemed routine. A weapons cache raid, quick in and out, the kind of mission that didn't make the news. Light resistance, the intel guys had said, maybe a few fighters. Maybe Ellie had come to hate that word. In this valley, maybe could get people killed. Now hunkered behind the wall, her fingers brushed the edge of her medical pack, her lifeline, her whole world crammed into a tan rucksack. Tourniquets, chest seals, morphine, clotting agents, everything designed for one purpose, to keep the dying alive long enough to make it to a helicopter. But helicopters didn't always come. And sometimes you had to keep someone breathing for hours while the fight raged on. Ellie's commander, Captain James "Hammer" Harrison, knelt a few feet ahead, scanning through his scope. He was the kind of officer soldiers followed not because they had to, but because they wanted to. Always the first one out of the vehicle, the last one to eat. He knew everyone's name, their families, their stories. He even remembered that Ellie's younger brother had enlisted last year. He looked back at her now, his eyes narrowing. "You feel that?" She nodded, too quiet. Harrison keyed his radio. "Eagle Eye, this is Hammer 1. You got any movement?" The Overwatch team answered from the ridgeline above. "Negative movement, Hammer 1. Thermal shows maybe 2 or 3 signatures inside the compound." That word again, maybe. Ellie exhaled slowly. The compound sat 100 meters ahead, low mud walls, one main gate, a few broken windows, deserted at least to the naked eye. But every soldier here knew the enemy could be right under their boots, hidden in tunnels dug generations ago. "All right," Harrison said quietly. "We go in fast and hard. Rodriguez, breach on my mark. Lewis, Thompson, you've got the flanks. Young, stay tight behind me." Ellie gave a quick nod, checking her pack one last time. The ritual never changed: count the tourniquets, check the morphine injectors, tighten the straps. The habit steadied her nerves. She'd been a medic for 6 years, Iraq twice, Afghanistan 3 times. She'd seen more trauma than most doctors ever would. But this was different, something about the air, the silence, the smell of dry earth that never forgot blood. Rodriguez moved to the gate, planting a small breaching charge. His voice came over the radio, barely above a whisper. "Set, breaching in 3, 2, 1. The explosion shattered the morning calm, rolling across the valley like thunder. The gate blew inward, dust billowing up in a tan wave. Harrison was first through, rifle raised. Ellie followed, M9 pistol drawn. And then the world erupted. Gunfire ripped from every direction, windows, rooftops, doorways. The walls came alive with muzzle flashes. The sound was deafening, chaotic, unreal. It wasn't 3 fighters. It was 30, maybe more. "Contact, contact," someone shouted. Ellie dove behind a stack of sandbags, her heart hammering. She saw Thompson, barely 19, first deployment, take a round square in the chest. His armor stopped it, but the impact spun him around. A second shot hit his neck. He dropped instantly. "Man down." She didn't think, she moved. Crawling through dust and flying brass, she reached him, hands already pulling gauze from her pack. Blood pulsed from the wound, hot and bright. "You're okay, Danny," she lied, pressing hard against his neck. "Just breathe, you're okay." He was okay. The bullet had nicked his carotid artery. She needed to stop the bleeding or he'd be gone in under a minute. Her fingers worked on instinct, pressure, gauze, seal. She jammed a hemostatic agent into the wound, the smell of iron filling the air. Around her, chaos reigned. Harrison's voice cut through the noise, firm, steady, unshakable. "Lewis, suppress that window. Rodriguez, grenade in the doorway. Move, move." RPGs screamed overhead, exploding against the walls. The ground shook, dust filled her mouth, but Ellie didn't stop. She finished the bandage, injected morphine, and dragged Thompson behind a half-collapsed wall. "Stay with me," she whispered. "Just stay with me." He blinked once, twice, but his gaze drifted. He was slipping away. She squeezed his hand, a silent promise, then forced herself to crawl back into the fray. That's when the second explosion hit. The Taliban had been waiting for them, waiting for exactly this. A buried IED went off beneath the floor of the compound, the shockwave throwing bodies into the air. Ellie felt herself lifted, weightless, then slammed into a wall. For a second, everything went white. The ringing in her ears drowned out the world. She could taste dust and copper. When her vision cleared, she realized she was lying in a shallow crater. Smoke poured through a gaping hole in the roof. The building was half collapsed. Screams echoed through the dust. And then she saw him. Commander Harrison down, motionless, his leg twisted at an impossible angle. Blood pumped from his thigh in dark, rhythmic bursts. Her heart seized, femoral artery. She crawled toward him, every movement deliberate, her training overriding panic. She tore open her last tourniquet, looped it high on his leg, and cranked it until the bleeding slowed. "Sir, stay still," she said, her voice trembling despite herself. Harrison tried to push himself up, the M4 still clutched in his hands. "The squad," he managed, his voice barely a whisper. "I've got you," she said, "just breathe." But when she looked around, she realized how bad it was. Half the squad was down. The rest were pinned, running out of ammo. The Taliban were regrouping, preparing to push through the breach. The radio crackled. Negative on air support, came the distant voice of the TOC. "Weather's grounding all aircraft. You're on your own for at least 2 hours." 2 hours. It might as well have been forever. Ellie's chest tightened. She could feel the weight of every decision pressing down on her. She wasn't supposed to lead. She was supposed to heal. But the only officer left breathing was fatting fast in her lap. Harrison's eyes fluttered open again, glazed with pain. He was trying to hand her his rifle. "Take it," he rasped. "They'll overrun us." "Sir, unite." Young, his voice cracked, but the authority in it hadn't vanished. "You're a soldier first, now lead." For a heartbeat, the words didn't make sense. She'd always been the one running toward the wounded, not the one giving orders. But now the squad needed both, a medic who could fight. She hesitated, staring at the weapon. Her reflection flickered in the scratched scope. She saw her own eyes, dust-covered, terrified, resolute. She took the rifle. "Hold the north wall," she shouted. "Anyone who can still shoot, find a window and make every round count." She checked the magazine, half full, not much, but enough for now. She took a position near the broken doorway, the sound of her own heartbeat thundering in her ears. The first Taliban fighter appeared through the smoke, AK raised. She squeezed the trigger. 3-round burst. The man dropped. Her stomach clenched. She never killed anyone before. But there was no time to think. Another fighter, another shot, then another. Every pull of the trigger was mechanical, practiced, but each one echoed somewhere deeper inside her. The part that still believed she was supposed to save life, not take it. "Reloading," Mitchell shouted from across the room. "Covering," Ellie yelled back, moving to suppress. The air filled with the smell of gunpowder and blood, every second stretched. Through it all, Harrison lay against the wall, pale but conscious, watching her. His lips moved, maybe a prayer, maybe her name, she couldn't tell. Then through the haze, she noticed something strange. The enemy wasn't advancing randomly. They were channeling their attack through 2 breaches, one on the east wall, one on the north. A predictable pattern, fatal funnels. A medic's brain worked in patterns, find the source, isolate the problem, act fast. She could use that. "Chen," she called to the radio operator who was crouched beside a shattered crate. "You still got grenades." 2 frags, 1 smoke. "Good, on my mark, throw smoke east side. Lewis, Mitchell, cover the left breach. Everyone else right, we hold them here." The team obeyed without hesitation. Even wounded, they moved with instinctive trust, the kind born in fire and fear. The smoke grenade hissed, flooding the room with a thick gray cloud. Gunfire crackled through it, blind, chaotic. Ellie counted seconds in her head. 3, 2, 1. Frag out. The twin explosions shook the compound. For the first time, the gunfire faltered. Ellie's hands trembled, adrenaline burning through her veins. She glanced back at Harrison. His breathing was shallow, but he gave her a faint nod, approval, pride, or maybe just acknowledgement that she'd done what needed to be done. And then over the radio, Chen's voice strained, desperate. "They're regrouping outside, more coming in." Ellie swallowed hard, her pulse pounded in her temples. The next wave was minutes away. They were almost out of ammo. She looked at the others, bloodied, exhausted, terrified, and saw in their faces the reflection of her own fear. But beneath it, something else, trust. They were looking to her now. And for the first time, she understood what leadership really meant. Not rank, not medals, just the willingness to act when everyone else is frozen. She reloaded the rifle and took a breath that burned her lungs. Outside, faint voices rose in Pashto, the enemy preparing another assault. Ellie's mind flashed back to the medevac briefings she'd attended years ago, the doctors who taught her how to keep a dying man breathing 1 minute longer. 1 more minute, they'd say, that's all you ever fight for. So she told herself the same thing now. Just 1 more minute, then another, then another. The first shadow moved through the doorway. She steadied her aim, exhaled halfway, and squeezed the trigger. The fight wasn't over, not even close. But something had changed inside her, something irreversible. She wasn't just a medic anymore. She was a soldier standing between death and her squad, armed with bandages and bullets alike. And as the dust swirled through the burning air of the valley, Ellie Young whispered to herself, half prayer, half promise. No one dies today. The gunfire had stopped. Not completely, just long enough for the silence to crawl back in, heavier than before. Ellie pressed her shoulder against the cracked wall, rifle raised, listening. The smoke was thinning, letting thin beams of light cut through the dust. It was beautiful, in a way, sunlight filtering through destruction. Then a single voice outside, shouting in Pashto. Another answered. And then laughter. They were regrouping. Ellie's stomach clenched. She could almost picture them, 30 or more Taliban fighters moving through the rubble, loading magazines, confident that the Americans inside were finished. She risked a glance toward Harrison. He was pale, too pale. The bandage on his thigh had already soaked through, dark crimson spreading fast. His eyes fluttered open, searching. Status, he rasped. Still breathing, Ellie said, forcing a half-smile she didn't feel. His gaze drifted past her toward the doorway. You need to move them back. This building's not gonna hold. I know, she said quietly, but where? He didn't answer. He didn't have to. The look in his eyes told her everything. There wasn't anywhere left to run. Chen's voice broke through the tension, low and tight. Comms are back up, but signals spotty. I got eagle eye on the line for 30 seconds. Ellie crawled over, her knees sinking into blood-soaked dust. Eagle Eye, this is Charlie Company. We're pinned in Sector 7 Alpha. We have multiple wounded. Request immediate support, over. The voice came back, distorted by static. Negative, weather cell moving in from the north. No air until it clears. 2 hours minimum. Ellie stared at the radio as if she could will it to change its mind. 2 hours. The phrase kept repeating in her head like a cruel joke. She looked at Chen. Keep trying, anything that flies. Yes, ma'am. She almost corrected him, don't call me ma'am. She wasn't in command, not officially, but the words stuck in her throat. Maybe she was now. From the north side of the room, Specialist Jennifer Jinx Mitchell limped over, blood streaking her temple. We're almost out of ammo. Rodriguez is down. Lewis has 1 mag left. Ellie's hand brushed against the medical pouch at her hip, useless against a firefight. Take what you can from the fallen, she said. Redistribute. Nobody keeps a full mag alone. Mitchell nodded, already moving. Ellie turned back to Harrison. His breathing was ragged, shallow. You stay awake, sir, that's an order. He chuckled weakly, a sound that was half laugh, half cough. You giving me orders now, Sergeant? She hesitated, then smiled. Somebody has to. But when she looked down, the reality hit her like a blow. His pulse was thready. His lips were turning blue, internal bleeding. The tourniquet had slowed the external flow, but the damage was deeper, shrapnel, probably punctured organs. He needed a surgeon, he needed a medevac. And all he had was her. For the first time that day, she felt helpless. Not the battlefield kind of helpless, but the kind that hollowed you from the inside, knowing you might not be enough. She took a deep breath, forcing the thought away. You're not dying today, sir. That's not negotiable. He tried to speak, but she pressed her hand gently against his chest. Save your strength, I'll handle the rest. A distant shout cut through the quiet. Then another. And then the sharp, metallic clack-clack of rifles being readied. Ellie looked toward the east wall. The enemy was gathering again, closer this time. The dull rhythm of boots crunching gravel echoed through the compound. Positions, she called out. Mitchell slid behind a window frame, her face grim but steady. Chen crouched near the door, checking his last magazine. Two other soldiers, Lewis and White, took up flanking positions, their movements sluggish, wounded but determined. Ellie checked her own weapon, 2.5 magazines left, not enough for what was coming. The first shot cracked through the air, slamming into the wall inches from her head. The next one shattered a section of brick, showering her with dust. Then the entire compound lit up again, a storm of bullets and shrapnel. She returned fire, short, controlled bursts, each one deliberate. Center mass. Exhale. Trigger. Bodies dropped in the doorway, but more filled the gaps. The Taliban were relentless shadows moving through the smoke, closing in with terrifying precision. Ellie ducked back behind the wall, gasping. Her rifle was hot against her hands. Across the room, Mitchell screamed, "I'm hit." Ellie was already moving, crawling through the debris to reach her. The bullet had grazed Mitchell's arm, deep but survivable. Ellie wrapped it fast with a field dressing. "Can you still fight?" "Barely." "Then fight," Ellie said, slapping a fresh magazine into her rifle. Mitchell nodded, grimacing through the pain. "Yes, ma'am." Another RPG streaked toward the building, hitting the far wall and detonating in a blinding flash. The shockwave knocked Ellie backward. Her ears rang. For a second she thought she'd lost consciousness, until she realized she was still firing, her body on autopilot. "Chen," she yelled over the chaos, "get me a sitrep." "They're inside the perimeter," he shouted back, at least 25 fighters closing from the east and north. Ellie looked down at Harrison. His eyes were half-lidded now, breath shallow. He was slipping. She couldn't let him die here, not like this. Adrenaline surged again, sharper this time. She crawled to him, slung his arm over her shoulder, and started dragging him toward the rear of the building. Every step felt like pulling a mountain, 200 pounds of gear and human life. Bullets hissed past, snapping at the air. "Young," Mitchell screamed, "they're breaching the east wall." "I know," Ellie shouted back, "hold them." Her boots dug into the dirt. Harrison groaned, his head rolling against her shoulder. "Leave me," he gasped, "get them out." "Not without you," she said, dragging him into what was left of a storage room. The walls were cracked, the ceiling sagging, but it was shelter for now. She eased him against the wall, hands moving automatically. Pulse check, bandage check, airway clear. He was fighting fast. She knew what that meant. She'd seen enough dying soldiers to recognize the signs, the distant eyes, the half-smile that said, "I already know how this ends." "Take my rifle," he whispered, pushing the M4 toward her. "The squad needs every gun." "Sir, I can't." "You can," he interrupted, his tone firm despite the weakness. "And you will." Ellie's throat tightened. "I'm a medic. I save lives." He stared at her, eyes sharp for the briefest moment. "You're a soldier first. Now act like one." Outside, the firefight roared again. The walls shook from another blast. Ellie could hear Mitchell shouting commands now, raw, desperate. She looked down at Harrison's rifle, at the black metal streaked with blood and dust. Her reflection stared back at her through the scratched surface, dirt-streaked face, trembling lips, eyes that no longer looked like her own. She picked it up. "I'll be back for you," she said softly. "I know you will," he whispered. "That's an order." Ellie stood, her breath steadying. Then she stepped out of the storage room and back into hell. The main chamber was chaos. Mitchell was crouched by the window, firing short bursts. Chen was out of ammo, hurling grenades instead. Two other soldiers were down, one screaming for a medic who couldn't come yet. Ellie dropped to one knee beside Mitchell. "Ammo." "Last mag." Ellie handed her one from Harrison's vest. "Make it count." She peeked through the smoke. Dozens of Taliban fighters were massing in the courtyard, moving between shattered walls. They were preparing for the final assault, the one meant to end it. She scanned their formation through the scope, the way they bunched together, the pattern of their movement, the rhythm of their fire. And then she saw it, two choke points, one on each side of the courtyard. Patterns, always patterns. In medicine, it was vital signs, pressure, pulse, rhythm. In combat, it was terrain, movement, noise. She could see the diagnosis. Now she needed the cure. "Chen," she called, "you got grenades left." "2 frags, 1 smoke." "Perfect." Pop smoke between us and that building across the courtyard. He hesitated. "You going somewhere?" "Yeah," she said, checking her magazine, "for supplies." Mitchell turned to her wide-eyed. "That's suicide." "So is staying here." Ellie waited for the smoke to bloom, thick, purple, swirling across the courtyard. Then she sprinted. Time slowed. Bullets sliced through the haze, invisible until they snapped past her head. One tore through her sleeve. Another shattered the ground near her boots. The smell of gunpowder and dust filled her lungs. She hit the far wall hard, shoulder first, and crashed through the half-open door of the adjacent building. Inside, silence, dust, crates stacked to the ceiling. She tore one open with her knife. Inside, she found exactly what she'd hoped for: ammunition, RPGs, even blocks of C4 wired with simple detonators. She exhaled a shaky laugh. Jackpot. Working quickly, she stuffed magazines into her vest, slung an RPG launcher across her shoulder, and grabbed 2 blocks of C4. Her hands moved automatically. Years of watching EOD tech's work had taught her enough to improvise. She set the timer for 3 minutes. Then she grabbed one more thing, Harrison's mantra echoing in her head: change the equation. She wasn't just surviving now, she was rewriting the fight. Ellie sprinted back into the smoke. Bullets chased her the whole way. One ripped through her medical pack, scattering supplies behind her like falling leaves. She didn't stop, she couldn't. She dove through the doorway just as the smoke thinned. Mitchell and Chen grabbed her arms, hauling her in. Ammo, she gasped, dropping everything. Load up, we move in 2 minutes. Move where? Mitchell demanded. Ellie's eyes flashed, anywhere but here. She turned toward the storage room, her body screaming in pain. Harrison was still there, barely conscious, his breathing shallow but steady. She knelt beside him, her voice soft now. I borrowed your rifle, sir, hope you don't mind. He smiled weakly. That's impressive. She didn't answer, she didn't have to. And then the explosion came, louder, deeper, earth-shaking. The entire weapons cache detonated, fire rising into the sky. The shockwave slammed through the compound, knocking everyone flat. When Ellie lifted her head, the world was orange and gray. The Taliban fighters outside were gone, vaporized or fleeing. For a long moment there was no sound but ringing ears and the crackle of fire. Then faintly, Mitchell's voice: What was that? Insurance, Ellie said. She looked down at Harrison, still breathing, still alive. The mission wasn't over yet, but the tide had turned. For now, the world burned around them. Fire crawled up the shattered walls, smoke rolled through the valley, and the smell of gunpowder clung to everything like a second skin. Ellie's hands shook as she gripped Harrison's vest straps and pulled with everything she had left. Move, move, she shouted. The others responded on instinct. Mitchell grabbed Rodriguez under one arm, half dragging, half carrying him toward the northern exit. Lewis stumbled beside her, blood dripping down his leg, still clutching his rifle. The explosion had done its job. The enemy was stunned, scattered. For the first time since the ambush began, there was open space ahead. Ellie dragged Harrison into the open air, her boots sliding in loose dirt. The sky above was gray now, thick clouds rolling in over the ridgeline, the weather cell the TOC had warned about. No sun, no birds, just the low growl of wind moving through the valley. Over here, Chen shouted, pointing toward a shallow depression in the earth, a natural dip in the terrain about 20 meters away. We can take cover there. Ellie didn't hesitate. Go, move the wounded first. They staggered across the open ground, stumbling, limping, carrying bodies and weapons and whatever was left of their strength. Ellie's lungs burned, her arms trembling under Harrison's weight, but she didn't stop. When they reached the depression, she dropped to her knees, easing him onto the dirt. It wasn't much, just a hollow barely 3 feet deep, but after hours of being under fire, it felt like a fortress. Set perimeter, she ordered. Check ammo, redistribute, and someone get me a comms check. Mitchell dropped beside her, gasping for breath. We're down to 6 who can still fight. Everyone else is wounded. Ellie's eyes swept the group, what was left of Charlie Company, 11 souls out of 12, half of them bleeding, all of them exhausted, but still alive. Harrison lay beside her, barely conscious, his eyes opened, unfocused. Status, he murmured. We're holding, she said, for now. He tried to smile, but it came out as a grimace. That's good work, Sergeant. She wanted to believe it, but when she looked around at the devastation, it didn't feel like victory. The mountains loomed above, silent witnesses to another firefight that would soon be forgotten. She pressed a gloved hand to Harrison's chest, shallow breaths, weak pulse. He was fatting, slower now but steady. The tourniquet held, but his skin was ice cold. She couldn't lose him, not after everything. Ellie looked up as Chen crouched beside her, radio in hand. I've got eagle eye again, he said. They've got a drone overhead, surveillance only, no weapons. Ellie grabbed the handset. Eagle Eye, this is Charlie Company, Grid 7 Alpha Niner. We're pinned with multiple casualties. What's your visual? The drone operator's voice crackled through the static. Charlie Company, we've got you on thermal. Be advised, we count at least 40 enemy fighters regrouping 300 meters east and closing. 40. She closed her eyes for a moment, forcing the number to settle. Any chance of air support? Negative, weather still heavy. Fast movers 20 to 30 minutes out minimum. Understood, she handed the radio back to Chen. Mitchell leaned over. 30 minutes, we can't hold that long. Ellie didn't answer right away. She scanned the horizon through Harrison's rifle scope. Through the haze, she could see shapes moving, clusters of fighters repositioning, preparing to encircle them. The tactical math was impossible. 6 able soldiers, 6 wounded, 40 hostiles. But she remembered something Harrison had once said during a training exercise. When the math doesn't work, change the equation. That phrase came back now like a whisper. Chen, she said, is there any artillery within range? He frowned, flipping through his notebook. Firebase lightning's about 15 clicks out, but we're danger close for that kind of fire. They'd never authorize it. Ellie checked the drone feed on his tablet, grainy black and white images showing enemy movement. The Taliban were tightening their line, converging on the depression. They won't need authorization, she said. We'll give them coordinates and take the shot. Chen blinked. That's suicide. We're inside the blast radius. Ellie met his eyes, and if we don't, we're already dead. He hesitated for a moment, then nodded. Roger that. The radio hissed with static as he patched through to the firebase. Lightning command, this is Charlie Company requesting immediate fire mission, danger close, Grid 7 Alpha Niner. A gruff voice came through. Charlie Company, that's well inside danger close range. Confirm you have cover. Ellie looked around at their shallow depression, no walls, no roofs, just dirt and rock. Barely cover at all, but it would have to do. She took the handset herself. This is Sergeant Young, confirmed, fire for effect. There was a long pause, then rounds out, 40 seconds. She dropped the handset and shouted, incoming, everyone down, danger close. The soldiers dove flat, covering their heads. Ellie threw herself over Harrison, shielding him with her own body. Then the world ended. The first shell hit 200 meters away, a deep-throated roar that tore the air apart. The second was closer, the ground leapt under them, a wave of earth and pressure. Ellie felt the impact through every bone. The air vanished from her lungs. Her ears rang so hard she thought she'd gone deaf. Dirt and debris rained down in sheets. Then silence. She lifted her head, gasping for breath. Smoke curled upward, black against the gray sky. Through the haze, she saw fire and movement, enemy positions obliterated, fighters thrown like rag dolls. Adjust fire, she shouted hoarsely. Drop 50, left 10. Chen relayed the coordinates. The next volley hit dead on. More explosions ripped across the ridge, flattening what was left of the enemy's eastern flank. The survivors broke. She could see them running now, tiny silhouettes darting through the dust, disoriented and terrified. Cease fire, she called, enemy retreating. For the first time in hours, the gunfire stopped. The ringing in her ears faded just enough to catch the distant sound of rotor blades, slow at first, then growing louder. Charlie Company, this is Dustoff 3-1, a new voice came over the radio. We're 5 mics out, pop smoke for visual. Ellie's breath caught, medevac. She fumbled for a smoke grenade, yanked the pin and tossed it uphill. A plume of green rose through the smoke and dust. They're coming, she said softly, almost in disbelief. The others barely reacted. They were too exhausted, too drained to celebrate. Mitchell collapsed backward, hands trembling. Chen slumped beside her, his face gray with fatigue. But Ellie couldn't stop moving. She crawled to each wounded soldier, checking pulses, adjusting tourniquets, whispering reassurance even if no one could hear it. When she reached Harrison, she found his eyes open again, unfocused but aware. You called that artillery, he murmured. Yeah, she said, had to. He gave a faint smile. That's some serious initiative. She almost laughed, but it came out as a broken exhale. You trained me too well, sir. The thrum of the Blackhawks filled the valley. Dust whipped through the air as the first bird came in low, its rotors chopping through smoke and wind. Door gunners laid down suppressive bursts even though the enemy was gone. The sight broke something in Ellie, not fear but release. The fight was finally over. Flight medics poured out, moving fast, efficient, shouting orders. Triage the wounded, who's in command here? Chen pointed to Ellie, that would be Sergeant Young. The medic looked at her, blood-spattered, helmet dented, face streaked with dirt. Harrison's rifle still slung across her chest. You're the medic who called in danger close. She nodded once. The medic gave a low whistle. Damn, that's a first. Ellie didn't answer. She was already helping them load Harrison onto a stretcher. His hand brushed hers as they lifted him. Thank you, he whispered. Just doing my job, she said. He smiled faintly. No, you did everyone's job. As the helicopter lifted off, Ellie stood back, shielding her eyes from the wind. The rotor wash whipped her hair across her face, mixing with the grit of the valley. When the sound finally faded, the silence returned, the heavy kind again, but this time it didn't feel like fear. It felt like survival. Mitchell walked over, limping, a half-smile on her cracked lips. That was, I don't even have words for that. Ellie looked at her, then at the devastation around them. I'm a medic, she said quietly. I'm supposed to save lives. You did, Mitchell said simply, all of ours. The wind shifted, carrying the smell of burned earth and diesel. The sun tried to push through the clouds, but couldn't. Ellie sank to her knees, her whole body trembling now that the adrenaline had finally left her. She'd been awake for 20 hours straight. She couldn't remember the last time she'd eaten or drunk water. Her fingers brushed against her medical pack, torn, bullet-riddled, half its contents gone, and yet it had done its job. Somewhere far off, she could hear more choppers approaching, reinforcements, relief teams. The fight was over. But inside, something had changed forever. She crossed a line that day, the invisible one between healer and warrior, and once crossed, it could never really be undone. For a long time, she sat in the dirt, staring at the horizon. Her hands, still trembling, looked alien to her. The blood on them wasn't just from others this time, she'd taken lives too. And in that silence, she asked herself the question she'd been avoiding since the first bullet flew. What does it mean to save a life if you have to take one to do it? The answer didn't come, it never really would. But as the rescue birds landed, kicking up clouds of dust, Ellie knew one thing with absolute certainty. The line between medicine and survival wasn't a rule, it was a choice. One she'd make again if it meant bringing her people home. She looked back toward the smoking ruins of the compound, the mountains standing like gray ghosts behind it, and whispered under her breath, part prayer, part confession. Sometimes the only way to save a life is to fight for it. The wind carried the words away. But they stayed with her long after the last helicopter vanished into the clouds. The valley was quiet again. But quiet didn't mean peace, not for Ellie. Even weeks later, she could still hear the echoes. The sharp crack of gunfire, the thud of artillery, the sound of Harrison's voice calling her name through smoke and chaos. Sometimes in her sleep, she could still feel the ground shaking beneath her, could still see the flashes in the dust when the shells hit. She would wake with her heart pounding, drenched in sweat, hand reaching instinctively for a rifle that wasn't there. The doctors at Bagram called it combat fatigue. Ellie called it remembering. 3 weeks had passed since the mission in the Corin Valley, 3 weeks since she dragged her commander through fire and called down artillery on her own position, 3 weeks since she'd become the soldier she never thought she could be. She sat alone in the recovery tent, her leg bandaged, IV running into her arm. The smell of antiseptic burned her nose, the sterile opposite of the battlefield. Outside, helicopters came and went, blades thumping endlessly through the desert air. She should have felt proud. They'd called her a hero. Command had already scheduled interviews, briefings, commendations. Someone mentioned a possible Medal of Honor recommendation. But Ellie didn't feel heroic, she felt hollow. She stared at her hands, clean now, washed a dozen times, but she still saw the blood there. Harrison's, Thompson's, hers. She flexed her fingers slowly, whispering to herself, "You're supposed to save lives." A shadow fell across her. "Mind if I sit?" It was Commander Harrison. He moved slowly, leaning on a cane, his right leg wrapped in a heavy brace. He looked thinner, older somehow, but he was alive. Ellie nodded, swallowing the lump in her throat. Of course, sir. He lowered himself onto the chair beside her cot with a quiet grunt. For a long time, neither of them spoke. The silence was heavy but not awkward, just full of everything they'd both survived. Finally, he said, "They tell me you're not talking much." Ellie shrugged, not much to say. "Bull," he said quietly, "you've got a lot to say, you're just not ready to say it yet." She looked away. Outside, medevac crews moved across the tarmac, loading stretchers, shouting orders. Life went on, as it always did. "I broke the oath," she said finally. Harrison frowned. "What oath?" "The medics do no harm." Her voice was barely a whisper. "I picked up your rifle. I killed men. I wasn't supposed to do that." He watched her carefully, his expression unreadable. Then he said, "You did what needed to be done." She shook her head. "That's what they all say. But what if that's just something we tell ourselves to make it feel okay?" For a long time, Harrison said nothing. Then, leaning forward on his cane, he spoke softly, the way he always did when it mattered. "Ellie, you didn't break anything. You didn't stop being a medic when you picked up that rifle. You became the kind of medic war needed you to be, a protector." She met his eyes, tired blue meeting hollow brown. "Then why doesn't it feel like that?" He smiled faintly. "Because you still have a conscience. The day this starts feeling easy, that's when you've got a problem." Ellie looked down again, her voice small. "I don't know how to be both, a healer and a soldier." "You already are," he said simply. That night she couldn't sleep. The base generator hummed outside, steady and low. She lay awake, staring at the fabric ceiling of the tent, thinking about his words. He'd called her a protector. But protectors weren't supposed to destroy, were they? The next morning she got her answer, not from philosophy, but from duty. "Sergeant Young," said the nurse at the door, "brigade wants you at debriefing, 800. Ellie nodded. The debriefing was held in a windowless tent lined with folding chairs and maps of the valley. Half a dozen officers sat around the table, intelligence, logistics, operations. They stood when she entered. "Master Sergeant Young," one of them began, "we've reviewed the after-action reports and drone footage. Your actions on the 16th were unprecedented." Unprecedented. That word again, she started to hate it as much as maybe. They went through the mission minute by minute, every movement, every radio call, every casualty. They asked about the weapons cache, the artillery strike, the command handover. At one point, a colonel leaned forward, hands clasped. "You called in artillery inside danger close parameters, less than 70 meters from your position. Were you aware that could have resulted in total loss of your unit?" Ellie looked him in the eye. "Yes, sir." "And you still authorized it." "I didn't have a choice." Another officer spoke. "Technically, you didn't have the authority either." Ellie paused. "Technically, the man who did was bleeding out." That shut them up for a moment. Finally, one of the older officers, gray-haired, tired eyes, leaned back in his chair and said quietly, "You made the right call, Sergeant. You saved those people." Ellie didn't answer. When the debriefing ended, the colonel stood and extended his hand. "You're being recommended for the Medal of Honor." Ellie froze. The words felt distant, unreal. "Sir, I don't." "It's already in motion," he said. "Commander Harrison himself wrote the citation." Her chest tightened. "I didn't do it for a medal." He smiled faintly. "The real ones never do." She walked out of the tent into the sunlight, if you could call it that. The Afghan sky was gray and flat, the air thick with dust, but for the first time since the ambush, she let herself breathe. Months passed. The scars on her body healed faster than the ones inside. By the time her rotation ended, she was back stateside, uniform pressed, hair trimmed, expression calm. On the outside, she looked whole again. On the inside, she still lived in that valley. She'd see flashes sometimes, a shadow moving through smoke, a hand reaching for help, Harrison's voice telling her to lead. In grocery stores, sudden noises made her flinch. In dreams, the artillery still fell. But slowly, life crept back in. Her mother met her at the airport, tears in her eyes. Her brother, now a corporal, saluted her, proud and wordless. Friends from old units sent messages, calling her a legend, a hero, a name that would be remembered. She smiled for them, but every smile felt borrowed. Then one morning, an official envelope arrived. The White House seal. She read it twice before it sank in. The President of the United States requested her presence for the Medal of Honor ceremony. Ellie sat on her couch for a long time, staring at the letter. The weight of it wasn't pride, it was something heavier, like the medal didn't belong to her at all, like it belonged to the ones who didn't make it back. The next day, she got a message from Harrison. "You better show up, I'm not standing through the whole ceremony for nothing." She laughed, the first real laugh in months. The ceremony was held 3 months later in the East Room of the White House. The air smelled of polished wood and old history. Cameras lined the walls, uniforms gleamed. Ellie stood among generals, cabinet members, and families of soldiers who hadn't come home. Her uniform was perfect, freshly pressed, every ribbon aligned. Her new rank, Master Sergeant, felt strange on her shoulders. When the president entered, everyone stood. The citation was read aloud, her name echoing across marble floors and chandeliers. For conspicuous gallantry and intrepidity at the risk of her life above and beyond the call of duty. The words blurred, she barely heard them. Her mind drifted back to the compound, to the dust, the blood, the silence after the artillery stopped. When the ribbon touched her neck, she didn't feel honor, she felt memory. Faces, voices, the sound of her own breathing in the middle of chaos. After the ceremony, there was a reception, polished silver, quiet music, polite applause. Harrison was there, walking with his cane, a scar running down his thigh. He moved slowly but with pride. When he saw her, he smiled, the same calm, grounding smile she'd followed into battle. "I never properly thanked you," he said. "You already did," she replied, "in the helicopter." He shook his head. "No, I mean it. You didn't just save my life. You saved all our lives. You became the leader we needed when we needed it most." Ellie looked down. "I just did what you would have done, sir." He chuckled softly. "No, young, you did what you had to do. That's what makes it exceptional." For a moment the noise of the room faded, the clinking glasses, the quiet laughter, the cameras flashing. There was just the two of them, two soldiers who had walked through hell and somehow come back. As Harrison walked away, Ellie turned toward one of the windows. The White House gardens stretched outside, peaceful, green, untouched by war. She thought about the valley again, about the dust, the fire, the silence. Two worlds, both real, separated by a thin line of courage and consequence. She whispered to herself, almost without realizing it. Sometimes courage isn't loud, sometimes it just does what needs to be done. A photographer asked her to smile. She did, but behind the smile her mind was still there, back in the valley where everything had changed. And deep down, she knew the medal around her neck wasn't for heroism. It was for survival. For choosing to fight when every instinct said run. For being both healer and warrior, even when it broke her heart to be both. That night when the lights were low and the celebration was over, she placed the medal on her desk. It gleamed faintly in the dark. She didn't touch it again for a long time. Why did the classroom feel harder than the battlefield? Ellie stood at the front of the briefing hall at Fort Sam Houston, staring at 20 new recruits in fresh uniforms, clean, eager, untouched by war. They watched her with wide eyes, half awe, half fear. None of them really knew what it meant to be a combat medic yet. She took a slow breath, feeling the weight of silence before she spoke. "First lesson," she said finally, her voice calm but steady. "You're going to see things that don't leave you. You'll treat wounds no textbook prepared you for. You'll hear sounds at night that come back years later." The room stayed quiet. She looked down at the floor for a moment, then back up at them. "Second lesson, you will want to save everyone, and you won't, but you'll try anyway because that's the job." One of the recruits, a young man barely out of high school, raised his hand. "Ma'am, is it true you picked up a rifle during that ambush in Helmand?" Ellie studied his face, earnest, curious, naive, the kind of question asked without malice, only fascination. She nodded slowly. "Yeah, it's true." "Were you scared?" he asked. Ellie paused for a moment, letting the question settle. "Of course I was. Everyone's scared. The trick isn't not being afraid, it's doing what you have to do anyway." She turned toward the whiteboard, writing in large letters. "Preserve life by any means necessary." "That's your mission," she said, turning back to them. "Sometimes that means pressure dressings and morphine. Sometimes it means calling in artillery. Sometimes," her voice softened, "sometimes it means picking up a rifle. You don't have to like it, you just have to understand it." They nodded, some slowly, some reluctantly. She could see it in their faces, that quiet moment when ideals meet reality. After class, the base commander, Colonel Harding, approached her in the hallway. He was tall, gray-haired, old school, a man who carried himself like he'd been carved out of command itself. "You're making waves," he said, his tone neither approving nor disapproving. "Good waves or bad?" she asked. He shrugged. "Depends on who you ask. Some of the instructors think you're rewriting doctrine. Others think you're blurring the line between healer and warrior." Ellie smiled faintly. "That line blurred a long time ago, sir. I just stopped pretending it didn't." He studied her for a long moment. "You know, when I was a medic in Desert Storm, we were told never to pick up a weapon unless it was to protect ourselves. Now, kids are quoting your mission reports in training." "That's not what I wanted," she said quietly. "But it's what happened." He started to walk away, then stopped. "You changed how the Army sees medics, young. That's not small. You ready to carry that?" She didn't answer right away. She just looked out the window at the training field, recruits crawling through the dirt, shouting commands, the sound of blank rounds echoing across the base. "I don't know if I changed it," she said finally. "Maybe I just made it face itself." That night she sat alone in her quarters, staring at the Medal of Honor lying on her desk. It caught the low lamplight, the blue ribbon glowing faintly. She hadn't touched it in months. The door opened softly behind her. Mitchell stepped in, the same wild, scarred grin she'd worn since that valley. She'd recovered mostly, still walked with a limp, still joked through pain. "You really live in here like a ghost," Mitchell said, tossing her bag onto the couch. "I thought big-shot heroes got corner offices." Ellie smiled. "I turned it down." "Of course you did." Mitchell sat opposite her, studying the medal. "You still hate that thing, huh?" "I don't hate it," Ellie said. "I just don't know what to do with it." Mitchell leaned back. "You earned it." "So did you," Ellie said. "So did every one of us that day." Mitchell chuckled. "Yeah, but you're the one they pinned it on. Guess it's easier to tell a story with one hero than a dozen survivors." That hit harder than Ellie expected. She looked at her friend. "We all did what we had to do." "Sure," Mitchell said softly, "but not everyone would have done what you did." Silence stretched. Outside, a light drizzle tapped against the window. Ellie looked down at her hands again, always her hands, the same ones that had stopped bleeding and caused it. "I still dream about it," she admitted. "About the artillery, the sound, the way it shook everything. I keep wondering if I could have done something different." Mitchell's smile faded. "You mean not called it in?" Ellie nodded. "You'd be dead," Mitchell said. "All of us would. You made the only choice there was." "I know," Ellie whispered, "but knowing doesn't stop you from feeling." Mitchell reached over, squeezed her shoulder. "You feel because you care. That's why we followed you." Ellie smiled weakly. "You didn't follow me. You survived with me." Mitchell stood, slinging her bag over her shoulder. "Same thing." After she left, Ellie sat in the quiet again, the metal still gleaming in the lamplight. She reached for it this time, fingers tracing the smooth metal. She remembered the sound of the chopper blades that day, Harrison's voice fading in and out, the moment when she realized she was the only one left to make a decision. Maybe leadership wasn't about knowing what was right. Maybe it was just about having the strength to live with what's necessary. The next morning, she woke before dawn. The sky over the base was pale gray, the kind of morning that always smelled faintly of dust and coffee. She walked out to the training field, where the new recruits were gathering for PT. One of the young medics, the same kid who'd asked her about the rifle, jogged over, breathless. "Master Sergeant, they said you might run with us today." Ellie smiled faintly. "We'll see if I remember how." As the group started their laps, she fell into pace beside them. The sound of boots hitting gravel brought back memories she thought she'd buried, the rhythm of survival. Halfway through the run, one of the recruits stumbled and fell. Instinct took over. Ellie was beside him in seconds, checking his breathing, helping him sit up. "You okay?" she asked. He nodded, embarrassed. "Yeah, just twisted my ankle." She smiled. "You'll live." It was such a simple phrase. She said it 100 times in combat, sometimes true, sometimes not, but this time it felt lighter. When the run ended, the recruits gathered around her again, sweaty and smiling. "Ma'am," one of them asked, "what's the one thing you wish someone had told you before your first deployment?" Ellie thought about it for a moment, Then she said quietly, "That bravery isn't loud. It's not the shouting or the medals or the speeches. It's what you do when no one's watching, when you're scared and tired and want to quit, but you don't." They nodded, silent again, and for a moment she saw it, a spark of understanding. Maybe not of war, not yet, but of what it meant to carry someone else's life in your hands. Later that week, the Army Chief of Staff visited the base. A man with decades of combat behind him, he'd been one of her biggest advocates after the ambush. He met her in the training field, away from the cameras and formality. "You've built something here," he said. "We're rewriting the manual on combat medicine, adding tactical training, expanded authority for medics in the field. You're part of that." Ellie nodded. "I just want them to be ready." He looked at her for a long moment. Some people still think medics shouldn't fight, that it breaks the Geneva protocols. Ellie's voice was calm but firm. "Protocols don't bleed, people do." The general smiled faintly. "That's a good line, mind if I borrow it?" She smiled. "Be my guest." He started to walk away, then paused. "For what it's worth, Sergeant, I think you found the balance. You didn't lose your humanity out there, you just expanded what it means." After he left, Ellie stood alone for a while, watching the recruits run drills. The wind moved through the field, carrying their shouts, their laughter, their futures. She thought about the valley, the dust, the fire, the sound of artillery, and realized something she hadn't before. She hadn't lost herself out there. She found the part of herself that refused to let others die without a fight. It didn't make her less of a medic. It made her more of one. As the sun broke through the clouds, she whispered the words she'd written on the board days before, almost like a prayer to no one in particular. "Preserve life by any means necessary." The wind carried the words away across the field. But she didn't need to hear them to believe them. The wind carried dust across the training range, hot, dry, relentless. It smelled faintly of burnt cordite and sweat, though no real gunfire had been used today, only blanks, simulations. Still, the memories crept in. Ellie stood with her arms folded, sunglasses shielding her eyes, watching the recruits move through the combat medicine exercise. They were good, methodical, focused, but their movements were too clean, too calm. War wasn't like this. War was never clean. She looked at her stopwatch. 37 seconds for the tourniquet, she called. "Too slow, that artery's already gone, start again." The trainees jumped, scrambling to reset their positions. One of them, a tall, dark-haired woman named Avery Cross, shot Ellie a look that was more defiance than frustration. Ellie caught it, filed it away. She knew that look. She'd worn it herself once. The look of someone who wanted to understand why, not just how. "All right," Ellie said, packing between them. "You're not just patching holes, you're buying time. Every movement you make decides if the person next to you goes home or ends up in a flag-draped box. That's the job." Silence. Then Avery spoke. Her voice was quiet but steady. "Permission to speak freely, Master Sergeant." Ellie stopped walking. "Go ahead." Avery swallowed. "Some of us read your after-action reports, about Helmand, about the artillery, the rifle, all of it." The rest of the recruits shifted uneasily, glancing at each other. Ellie nodded. "I'm aware." Avery hesitated. "I'm trying to understand something, ma'am. You swore an oath to preserve life, to do no harm. How did you—" She caught herself, searching for words. "How did you justify killing to save people?" The question hung in the air. The other recruits froze. It was the kind of thing no one dared to ask out loud, but it was the question every one of them carried quietly. Ellie didn't answer right away. She walked toward the edge of the training field, the dry grass crunching under her boots. For a long moment she just stood there, staring at the horizon, the same pale sky she'd stared at in Helmand. Then she turned back to them. "You ever watch someone bleed out, Cross?" Avery hesitated. "No, ma'am." "Then you don't know yet. You don't know how fast it happens. You don't know the sound it makes when someone realizes they're dying and there's nothing you can do." Her voice didn't rise, but the quiet weight in it filled the air. She took a breath, steady but trembling. "I've treated wounds that made me sick to my stomach. I've held men and women while they begged me not to let them die. I've done everything right and still lost them. You can't train for that." Avery swallowed hard, "But that still doesn't." Ellie cut her off, not unkindly. "You're right, it doesn't justify killing, it never will. Nothing does, but it explains survival. That's the difference." She stepped closer, lowering her voice. That day in the valley, I didn't pick up a rifle because I wanted to. I picked it up because if I didn't, no one would have left that valley alive, including the wounded I swore to protect. My job didn't change, my tools did. Avery's eyes dropped to the ground. So you think it was worth it? Ellie didn't answer, she just said, ask the men who made it home. Silence again. Then she added softly, and ask the part of me that still wakes up at 3 a.m. hearing their voices. The recruits said nothing, they didn't need to. The truth hung between them, heavy, unpolished, real. Ellie walked back toward her station, reset the exercise. This time you do it with chaos, smoke, noise. I want screaming, confusion, because that's what it's like out there, saving lives when everything around you's falling apart. She pulled a canister from her pocket, yanked the pin, and tossed it. Smoke filled the range instantly, thick and choking. The trainees hesitated, coughing, fumbling with their gear. Move, Ellie shouted. Find your casualty, prioritize, assess, work through it. The recruits scrambled, shouting over the din. Their voices broke, commands tangled, but slowly, one by one, they began to adapt. Ellie watched through the haze. Their silhouettes looked like ghosts in the smoke. She remembered being one of them, unsure, terrified, pretending she was. When the drill ended, she called them back to formation. Sweat streaked their faces, some looked shaken. That was good. It meant they were beginning to understand. You're medics, Ellie said, but don't forget you're soldiers too. The battlefield won't wait for you to be one or the other. You'll have to be both at once. After dismissing them, she stood alone again, watching as they disappeared toward the barracks. The wind lifted the last wisps of smoke away, leaving only the smell of burnt powder. She turned to find Avery still there. The young woman's expression had changed, not defiant anymore, just uncertain. I wasn't trying to disrespect you earlier, ma'am, Avery said. I just wanted to understand what kind of medic I'm supposed to be. Ellie gave a small nod, the kind who makes sure people come home, however that has to happen. Avery looked down. My dad was a field surgeon. He always said violence and medicine don't mix. Ellie smiled faintly. Neither do oil and water, but put them in the same bottle, shake hard enough, and they learn to live together. That made Avery laugh softly despite herself. She saluted. Thank you, ma'am. After she left, Ellie sat down on the low wall overlooking the range. The sun was setting, that soft, burnt orange light that always made her think of home. She pulled out her phone and opened the folder she hadn't touched in months, photos from the mission. There was one of Harrison months later in recovery, smiling weakly with his cane. One of Mitchell at a bar, laughing with a beer in hand. One of Chen standing beside the Predator drone team, a little older, a little prouder. They were all alive, every one of them. That was the equation she'd changed. Her phone buzzed, a message from Harrison. Got your speech for the annual medic symposium yet? Don't make me write it for you. Ellie smiled. She'd forgotten that was coming up. The Army Medical Corps had invited her to speak about leadership under fire. The irony wasn't lost on her. 2 days later, she stood behind a podium at Fort Bragg, the auditorium filled with officers, medics, and veterans. Cameras flashed, murmurs filled the air. When the lights dimmed, she began. They asked me to talk about leadership, she said, but leadership isn't something you talk about, it's something you live through, and usually it hurts. She paused, the room was utterly still. I was trained to save lives, that was my mission, but war doesn't care about your mission. It changes the rules, breaks them, rewrites them in blood and chaos. And when that happens, you don't think about what's right or wrong, you think about who still has a pulse. Her voice softened. That day in Helmand, I picked up my commander's rifle because I realized something simple and terrible. If I didn't fight, I couldn't save. Sometimes the difference between a corpse and a casualty is the will to act, even when it breaks you. She glanced around the room. Every face was fixed on her. I'm not telling you to become killers, she said. I'm telling you to become protectors, to understand that preserving life sometimes means standing between it and death, however you have to. A medic's oath doesn't end when the gunfire starts, it begins there. She stopped, looked down. The silence felt heavy again, but this time it was the kind that carried meaning. Then she added quietly, and if you ever find yourself wondering whether it was worth it, whether what you did was right, that's how you know you haven't lost yourself. When she stepped off the stage, the applause was soft at first, then steady, respectful. Not loud, not celebratory, just honest. Later, Harrison found her backstage, leaning on his cane, that same wry grin on his face. You've come a long way from the woman who once told me she doesn't give speeches, he said. Ellie smiled. I still don't, I just tell the truth. He nodded, eyes gleaming with quiet pride. You know, young, what you did back then, it didn't just save us. It started a conversation that's still changing this army. She tilted her head. You mean the doctrine revisions? He chuckled. No, I mean the way people think about courage, about compassion under fire. You made it okay to be both, to care and to fight. Ellie looked at him for a long time. Then she said softly, I didn't make it okay. I just stopped pretending it wasn't necessary. Harrison nodded. Maybe that's what courage really is. As the two of them walked outside, the air was cool, a rare break in the Texas heat. The night was quiet, still open. Ellie looked up at the stars, clear, endless, and for a moment she thought of that night sky over Helmand. The difference was, this one didn't feel like survival. It felt like peace. Harrison followed her gaze. You ever think about going back, not to fight, but to visit? She shook her head. Some places don't need revisiting. They already live in you. He smiled faintly. Fair enough. They stood there in silence for a while, two soldiers who'd carried the same ghosts, now sharing the same quiet. And for the first time since that valley, Ellie realized she wasn't running from what she'd done. She was teaching from it, living with it, owning it, and maybe finally healing because of it. It started like any other training day. Blue skis, Texas heat already pushing 90 degrees before 9 a.m., and the sound of rotor blades from a medevac Blackhawk circling over the field. Ellie stood at the edge of the range, clipboard in hand, watching the trainees move through the final field evaluation. They were sharp, better than most classes she'd taught, focused, disciplined, learning fast. Avery Cross led the exercise, calm under pressure, commanding without shouting. Ellie couldn't help but smile. That spark she'd seen in the young woman's eyes had turned into something solid. The drill was simple, simulated IED strike, rapid triage, extraction under fire, controlled chaos. They'd rehearsed it for weeks. Then halfway through the run, something changed. The first explosion wasn't simulated. The ground shuddered, a sharp, concussive whump that tore through the air. The trainees froze, confusion flashing across their faces. Who set that off? Ellie barked. But no one answered. Then came the second blast, closer, louder, followed by a scream. Ellie didn't think. She dropped the clipboard and ran. The smoke rose in a thick gray column near the east end of the range, just beyond the safety markers. When she reached the site, her stomach dropped. A training vehicle, an old Humvee used for drills, was on its side, flames licking the engine block. Two trainees were down nearby, one unmoving, the other clutching his leg, blood soaking through his uniform. Ellie hit the ground beside them, instincts kicking in before her mind caught up. Cross, get the fire suppressed. You call base emergency medevac now. Avery sprinted toward the Humvee, grabbing a fire extinguisher while shouting orders to the others. Ellie pressed her hands to the wounded trainee's thigh, searching for the source. Femoral artery, hit clean through. The world narrowed to the same tunnel it always did when life hung in the balance. Stay with me, she said, voice calm even as her heart pounded. You're okay, I've got you. The boy, barely 20, tried to speak, but only managed a gasp. Ellie pulled a tourniquet from her belt and cinched it tight, twisting until the bleeding slowed. Then she moved to the second trainee, unconscious, shallow breathing. She tilted his head back, checked the airway, saw the faint flutter of pulse at the neck. Breathing but not responding, she muttered. Possible concussion, get me a stretcher. The trainees moved fast now, panic giving way to purpose. They'd trained for this, but never thought it would happen here, not on a range, not in America. Avery slid beside her, smoke streaking her face. Ma'am, fire, under control, vehicles clear. Good work, Ellie said, barely glancing up. What's the medevac ETA? 5 minutes. 5 minutes. She could do a lot in 5 minutes, or lose everything. She checked the wounded trainee's pulse again, thready, weak. His lips were pale, he was going into shock. Cross, elevate his legs, get me another pressure dressing. Avery obeyed instantly, her hands steady despite the adrenaline. Ellie watched her work for a moment, saw the same focus she'd once seen in herself years ago, the controlled chaos of a medic who refuses to let go. When the chopper finally arrived, Ellie and Avery helped load the injured trainees aboard. The rotor wash blasted dirt into their faces, drowning everything in noise. Ellie shouted over the blades, "Tell them to prep for massive transfusion protocol. He's lost too much blood." The flight medic gave her a thumbs up. As the helicopter lifted off, Ellie stepped back, shielding her eyes. The noise faded slowly until only the wind remained. Avery stood beside her, shaking. Was that a real IED? Ellie nodded grimly. Looks like someone missed an old training ordnance. Could have been buried for years. The young medic stared at the departing Blackhawk, her jaw clenched. He's going to make it right. Ellie looked at her, really looked, and saw herself years ago, kneeling in Afghan dirt, praying for the same thing. "I don't know," she said quietly, "but we gave him a chance. That's all we can ever promise." Hours later, the report came in. The trainee had survived, critical but stable. The other suffered only minor injuries. Ellie sat alone in the infirmary office that night, staring at the medical chart in her hands. Her pulse still hadn't slowed, her hands still trembled. It had been years since she'd seen that much blood. Years since the smell of smoke and diesel had sent her heart racing. Years since she'd heard that sound, the hollow silence that follows an explosion. And yet the moment it happened, she hadn't hesitated, not once. That scared her more than the blast itself. A knock at the door pulled her back. Avery stepped in, still in her torn fatigues, eyes heavy with exhaustion. "Permission to speak freely." Ellie gestured to the chair, always. Avery sat, leaning forward on her knees. "When it happened out there, I froze for a second, just 1 second, and in that second I thought, what if I can't do it? What if I'm not built for this?" Ellie nodded slowly. "You froze because you're human. The ones who say they don't, they're lying or broken. The trick isn't not freezing, it's what you do next." Avery looked at her. "And what did you do next, that day in Helmand?" Ellie exhaled, eyes distant. "I stopped thinking. I just did what needed to be done. Sometimes the body remembers before the mind can catch up." Avery was quiet for a long time. Then she said softly, "Is that what makes someone a hero?" Ellie almost laughed, not out of humor, but out of disbelief. "No, heroes are just the ones still standing when it's over, that's all." Avery looked down. "He's alive because of you." Ellie shook her head. "He's alive because of us. You did everything right, Cross. You stepped up." Avery smiled faintly. "I learned from the best." That night, Ellie walked out to the edge of the airfield. The sky stretched endless and dark, the kind of silence that made her chest ache. She could still see the smoke from the earlier explosion drifting faintly over the hills. A training accident, they'd called it. But for Ellie, it had been something else, a reminder. You never really leave the battlefield, it just finds new ways to test you. She thought about calling Harrison, but decided against it. He'd only say what he always did, that she was still trying to carry the world alone. And maybe he'd be right. Instead, she sat on the edge of the tarmac and watched another medevac helicopter land. The red cross on its side glowed under the floodlights, almost ethereal. There was something sacred about that symbol, not of peace, but of promise. The unspoken vow that no matter how bad it got, someone would always come for you. Ellie remembered the first time she'd seen that cross under fire, painted on a Blackhawk, streaked with dirt and blood. Back then, it had meant hope. Maybe it still did. The next morning, she visited the hospital. The trainee, Private Allen, was awake, pale but smiling weakly. When he saw her, his voice cracked. "Master Sergeant, thank you." Ellie smiled. "Don't thank me, thank your team. They did everything right." He hesitated. "You were there, though. I remember your voice." Her smile softened. "Yeah, sometimes that's all it takes, a voice that doesn't sound afraid." She stayed until he fell asleep, then stood at the foot of his bed, looking down at the monitors, the IV lines, the rhythm of steady beeping. Life. Still fragile, still fighting. Outside, Avery was waiting in the hall. "He's gonna be fine," she said. Ellie nodded. "Good, make sure his team knows that." As they walked back toward the exit, Avery hesitated. "Can I ask you something, ma'am?" "Go ahead." "Do you ever stop hearing it?" Ellie frowned. "Hearing what?" "The echoes, the ones that stay after the noise stops." For a moment, Ellie didn't answer. She just stared down the long hallway, the sterile white lights, the distant hum of machines, so far from the dirt and fire of Helmand, yet somehow the same. Finally, she said quietly, "No, you just learn to listen differently. You start to hear the good echoes too, the ones that remind you why you did it." Avery nodded slowly, eyes glistening. Like today. Exactly like today. They stepped outside into the morning light. The sun was bright, warm, the kind of day that almost felt unfair in its beauty. Ellie looked up, feeling the heat on her face, and for the first time in a long time, she didn't think about artillery or fire or blood. She thought about breath, steady, quiet human. Behind her, the medevac helicopter lifted off, blades cutting the air in rhythmic pulses. The sound used to mean chaos to her. Now it sounded like life. She turned to Avery, who was still watching the chopper ascend. "You did good today," Ellie said softly. "Didn't feel like it," Avery admitted. Ellie smiled faintly. "That's how you know it was real." The wind picked up, carrying the sound of the rotors into the distance. And in that moment, standing on American soil, alive, unarmed, but still ready, Ellie realized something profound. Maybe healing wasn't about forgetting what happened. Maybe it was about learning to stand in the same silence that once haunted you and finally breathe in it. The world didn't end with a bang. It ended quietly in the stillness between heartbeats. At least that's what Ellie used to think. Years had passed since the valley, the medal, the training field. She'd grown older, quieter, wiser, though she'd never admit it out loud. The lines around her eyes weren't from age, they were from memory. She still woke early, before the sun, before the noise, out of habit more than need. Some mornings she made coffee and just sat by the window, watching the light creep across the kitchen floor. Peace, she'd learned, wasn't loud. It was the absence of fear in the small, forgotten moments. Her house was tucked away near the edge of a small town in North Carolina, close enough to the base to hear the distant choppers on training days, but far enough that the nights were quiet. On her wall hung two things: the folded flag from her last deployment and a framed photo of her unit, dust-covered, exhausted, alive. The medal sat in a box in the drawer below, still polished, still untouched. People had stopped asking her to give speeches. She didn't mind, words had their time, silence did too. But today was different. The phone rang just as the morning light broke through the window. It was Avery. "Ma'am," her voice carried that same urgency Ellie remembered from the training field years ago. "We're holding the annual medic memorial tomorrow. I was hoping you'd come." Ellie hesitated. "I haven't been to one of those in a while." "I know," Avery said softly, "but this year we're dedicating it to the Corin Valley team." Ellie froze, the words caught somewhere deep in her chest. The Corin Valley. The name still echoed like thunder in her bones. "I'll be there," she said finally. The memorial field was quiet when she arrived the next morning. Rows of white chairs faced a simple granite wall carved with names, medics who died in service. A few were still familiar to her, some she'd trained, some she'd served beside. One had even written to her the week before he deployed, a letter she still kept folded in her wallet. Avery greeted her near the front. Her hair was shorter now, her posture confident, a reflection of everything Ellie had once been, and more. "Good to see you, ma'am," Avery said, saluting with a grin. Ellie smiled. "Drop the ma'am, you've earned first names." "Ellie then," Avery said almost shyly. "You sure about that?" "Yeah," Ellie said, "feels strange, but right." As the ceremony began, Ellie sat quietly, hands folded in her lap. Families gathered, soldiers stood in formation, the flag rippled in the wind. The chaplain spoke about sacrifice, the kind of words she'd heard 100 times before, but today they landed differently. Maybe because she wasn't thinking about loss anymore. She was thinking about what came after. When Avery took the podium, her voice carried clear and steady. "We talk about courage a lot in this job, but courage isn't always charging forward. Sometimes it's holding pressure on a wound when your own hands are shaking. Sometimes it's staying when every instinct tells you to run." Ellie watched her with quiet pride. Avery wasn't performing, she was living it. "I learned that from someone who showed me that being a medic isn't about choosing between saving or fighting," Avery continued. "It's about never stopping, no matter what form it takes." The crowd turned slightly, eyes flicking toward Ellie. She shifted uncomfortably but didn't look away. Avery smiled faintly. "She probably hates that I'm saying this, but Master Sergeant Ellie Young taught me, and all of us, that mercy and strength can exist in the same hands." For a moment the silence was absolute. even the wind stilled. Ellie didn't move, her throat tightened, her eyes burning just enough that she had to look down. After the ceremony, people came to thank her, soldiers she'd never met, medics who'd trained under her lessons. Some carried scars, some smiles, all gratitude. She shook hands, nodded, said little. Her words had never mattered as much as her actions. Later, when the crowd thinned, she found herself standing alone by the granite wall. The sun had started to set, the light turning golden across the engraved names. She traced her fingers along the letters, cool, smooth, unyielding. Then she stopped at one she hadn't expected. Staff Sergeant Daniel Chen. Her breath caught. He hadn't made it. A wave of quiet sadness moved through her, not sharp, not overwhelming, but deep and steady, like a tide she'd carried for years. He'd been one of the drone techs who'd stayed behind in Helmand, part of the support unit that didn't make it home. She remembered his face, serious, kind, steady. The kind of soldier who never got headlines, only silence. She stood there a long time, just breathing, just remembering. A voice spoke behind her. He used to talk about you. Ellie turned. It was a woman older, with the same calm eyes Chen had. I'm his sister, she said. You're Ellie, right? Ellie nodded slowly. Yes, ma'am. He said you saved lives that day, the woman said softly. He said you never hesitated. He wanted us to know he believed in what you were doing. Ellie's throat tightened again. He was one of the best. I never got to tell him that. The woman smiled faintly. You just did. They stood together for a while, neither speaking. The sun dipped lower, throwing long shadows across the grass. When the woman finally left, Ellie stayed behind. She looked at Chen's name one last time, then whispered, I hope it was enough. The wind moved through the field, gentle, almost like an answer. That night, Ellie drove home in silence. The highway was empty, the sky clear and endless. Somewhere in the distance, a helicopter crossed the horizon, just a shadow against the stars. She pulled over on a quiet overlook, killed the engine, and stepped out. The air was cold, crisp, alive. For years, she'd carried the same question, unspoken, unanswered. Had she done the right thing? Had she become the soldier she swore she'd never be? Tonight, for the first time, she didn't need an answer. She walked to the edge of the overlook and sat down, watching the blinking light of the helicopter fade into the night. That sound, that steady, rhythmic thrum, used to fill her with dread. Now it filled her with peace. Because she knew someone was up there right now, doing what she'd once done, keeping others alive. And maybe, just maybe, the lessons she'd bled for still mattered. She reached into her jacket pocket and pulled out something she hadn't touched in years, the medal. The blue ribbon had faded slightly, the metal cool against her skin. She held it up to the moonlight, letting it catch the glow. It wasn't pride she felt. It wasn't guilt either. It was something quieter, acceptance. She whispered almost to herself, it was never about honor, it was about not walking away. The wind brushed through the trees, carrying the faint sound of rotors somewhere far away. Ellie smiled, small, genuine. She placed the medal back in her pocket, stood, and looked one last time at the stars. Sometimes, she said softly, dignity doesn't speak. A pause, a breath, a heartbeat. It simply acts. The next morning, Avery found a note in her mailbox at the base. No return address, just a folded sheet of paper, neatly written in Ellie's sharp, steady handwriting. For every medic who ever doubted they were enough. Remember, courage isn't what keeps you from breaking. It's what helps you heal afterward. Ly. Avery read it 3 times before tucking it into her uniform pocket. Outside, the sound of choppers echoed faintly over the horizon. She looked up, smiled, and whispered under her breath, "Copy that, Master Sergeant." Then she turned back toward the training field, toward a new day, a new generation, and the same promise. Because wars end. But what people like Ellie Young leave behind doesn't.